Houston, we have a problem. These were of course, the words that were used by the astronauts as they discovered that they did have a major problem on their attempted flight to the moon, Apollo 13, as they reported back to the base in Houston. And they were memorialised, really, I suppose, in the Tom Hanks movie, Apollo 13, where, if you watch the movie, you see how they retell how the crew and the ground team spent hour after hour trying to solve the problem, come up with a solution to the problem. Well, we also have a problem, and we've spent not just hours, but centuries, millennia, in fact, trying to figure out a solution. In fact, so long now that society, by and large, has forgotten the source of the problem altogether. Now we just see the flow-on problems in the world around us. Loneliness, depression, anger, corruption, increase in crime, family breakdown in values, sanctity of life. And we see this and kind of know deep down that there's a fundamental problem with what's happening, a fundamental problem with the way that humanity is tracking. And in spite of the promises of the age of reason, as it was called, and what became known as modernity, it was supposed to be a solution that was thought that would eventually create this perfect world, this utopia built on science and reason and all that went with it. And when it didn't deliver, postmodernism sort of came along and eased its way into our thinking in an effort to help us cope with all these problems we see around us, allowing us, in effect, to barricade ourselves in to our own little world with the excuse that what others do is their problem. I'll just worry about myself and my truth. With such a depleted view of what truth is, we further blind ourselves to the real heart of the problem. And worse, to the very one who has provided a solution to this problem. You see, the problem's this: humanity in its sin, in its rejection of God, has broken the good and right relationship that people were meant to have with God. And that's a major problem. It places us under judgment. It means we become more and more blinded and hard-hearted to our need for God. Our need for God. And so although we might try to patch up the problems we see around us, or we might work and strive to find God, we never will. It is only God who has the solution to this fundamental problem of the sin of humanity. God could see that we would never get to Him, no matter what we did, in spite of our best interests. In spite of us striving to do it, we would not be able to get back to Him, to know Him, to be truly human, to live in relationship with God as He created us to be. So what did God do? He chose to take action. We have come through the Genesis series just recently, and we called that Salvation Begins. If you remember, we saw how God came down to His creation, and He chose in His grace, He chose Abraham. It was through Abraham that He created out of nothing really a people for Himself, a people that He'd call His own, restored relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people, is the phrase that rings out as you read through Genesis and on through the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. And so all of a sudden we see there was this God-generated connection between God and this group of people. And God, in His grace, provided a way to maintain that connection, to make sure that it was there and there was access to Him. And so He gave the Old Testament law that we read through the first chapters of the Old Testament. And especially He set aside priests and showed them what they could do to connect God with His people, so that a holy God could be connected to an unholy people. And it was through these appointed mediators, these priests, that Israel was able to maintain covenant, to maintain relationship, to maintain peace with God. to ensure that the problem of separation from God would not return. But written large through the Old Testament is something else. The fact that at some point in time, a new covenant, a new way of dealing with God would be established. And this old covenant, as it came to be called, would be superseded. The implication is throughout the Old Testament that this old covenant would be set aside, that God would establish something new, a new order, a better and more permanent relationship with his people. What is it? What's it going to look like? There's these tantalizing kind of snippets in the Old Testament. The faithful people of God, the faithful Jews, would have waited in anticipation, longed in fact for the day when God would act on these promises and make this new covenant. And so along comes Jesus. That is the understatement of the year, by the way. Just to finish off that long introduction. You'll be getting a bit worried now because last week Eric preached for 20 minutes on a 5-verse passage. I've got a whole chapter this morning, and I haven't even got there yet. So along came Jesus, a priest. We see him being called a priest right through Hebrews, a mediator between God and his people, between God and humanity. This long-promised mediator of all mediators, the true and only high priest, fulfilling all the requirements and conditions to be a true mediator. Fully man, fully God, a foot in each camp, if you like. And we've been talking about mediator over the last 4 or 5 weeks through this mini-series of Hebrews about mediator. A perfect appointment. Perfect for the job of mediation, except though for one small problem that would have been glaringly obvious for any Hebrew or Jew coming to put their faith in Christ. One glaring problem. He was not from the priestly family of the Old Covenant. He was not a Levite. This will not do, they would have said. God has chosen the Levites of the Old Testament to be the priests. God has ordained them to maintain the connection between God and his people. I think we should maybe just slip back down to the temple and see these other priests and sacrifice the odd lamb to make sure where things are okay here. This is, it seems, what's happening as Hebrews and what Hebrews is addressing. And so what chapter 7 here does is kind of weighs in on this argument, weighs in on this, and sort of to summarise, the author basically says, don't be so stupid. The trouble is he doesn't say that in such simple terms. Instead he uses quite a technical and involved argument, or a series of arguments that kind of maybe when you're hearing him read, or when you read chapter 7 of Hebrews, kind of make you want to either go to sleep or throw the Bible down because you don't understand a thing of what's going on. But if we boil all this stuff down of Hebrews 7 that we just heard, we come to see that this is exactly what Hebrews is saying. Don't be so stupid. Jesus is it now. He's the permanent and only mediator for his people. Yes, you're right. The Levites of the Old Testament were the rule. They were established by God, a family of mediators that God ordained. God established them as this rule, this pattern to live by for God's people, if you like. He ordained them as priests. But listen here, there is an exception to this rule. Have you ever read Genesis 14? Because that's where you meet an exception to this rule. It's here that you meet this chap called Melchizedek, right? Who Abraham meets on the way back from battle and gives a tenth of his spoils, and Melchizedek blesses him. Chapter 14 of Genesis. Who's Melchizedek, you ask? It's a good question. Who is Melchizedek? But perhaps it's not so much who he is, but rather who he is not. That's more important. Because he's not from the family of Levi, from the family of priests. He's an exception here. In fact, he's from no family at all, according to Genesis, when you read it, which is quite odd for Genesis if you think about it. What does Genesis spend chapters doing? When you read, if you've read the Bible from the start, where's the first place you start thinking about giving up? The genealogies. They spend so long showing how God's purposes come through, down through the generations. Not Melchizedek. What's going on? He just appears in the account of Abraham and then disappears again. And verse 3 of Hebrews 7 picks up on this. Melchizedek, having no father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of Man, he remains a priest forever. Now, this is not to say that Melchizedek is some superhuman that lived forever. Rather, that his ancestors didn't make him a priest, just like the Levites did. It's this sort of priest, in fact, that Jesus is, not because of his descent. And so, as verse 17 says, which is, we've come across this verse a few times in Hebrews already, and I've kind of skipped over it because it was coming, chapter 7. Verse 17 of chapter 7, you are a priest forever, it says, in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Levi. That's a different covenant. And so chapter 7 then goes on to spend quite a bit of energy showing just how much superior this new priestly order of Melchizedek is compared to the priests of Levi, the Old Testament. And so just quickly, if you look at verse 3 to 10, especially, it seeks to show how Melchizedek and therefore Jesus is superior because Melchizedek, and therefore Jesus by implication, blesses the inferior, Abraham, and therefore the Levites, because Abraham's descendants were the Levites. I told you it's complicated. This is what happens. It goes on through to verse 21, pretty much to say, again, don't be so stupid about what you're thinking. Jesus is not a priest because of his descent. Rather, he is a priest because God said so. And this quote, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, is a quote from Psalm 110, which is God giving an oath that this Jesus will come, this priest of a new covenant will come to be the one true mediator. In fact, Hebrews is pretty much taking this verse in the Old Testament and explaining it to us. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And so this is what I think chapter 7 here is saying. Yes, on the one hand, you have the Levite priests, and they were the mediators, the go-between of the Old Covenant. But on the other hand, you also have another priesthood, a mediating role that is far superior to the Levites, the Old Testament, a priesthood that sort of overarches everything else, a priesthood that is kind of like an umbrella over everything else. Who does this point us to? As Hebrews speaks and tells us, this better way to draw near to God, as Hebrews says. Who does it point to? The high priest of this better way, this new covenant, the mediator of all mediators, Jesus. And so don't go back to your old ways, Hebrews saying, to the old covenant system, the old way of relating to God that God put in place, sure, but now he's shown a new and better way. Because this Jesus is the mediator of a better relationship. The guarantee, as verse 22 says, of a better covenant. And so by this point in the chapter, verse 22, I think we've got through all the technical arguments about Levites and Melchizedek. So if you have gone to sleep, you can wake up now, because what we get now is the good stuff, really. We get to the real message of this chapter, that Jesus is our priest forever, a permanent mediator between God and humanity. You see, verse 23 goes on to remind us of just how many priests there were in the Old Testament. They kept dying. That's what it pretty much says. And a dead priest is not much good as a priest. And so they had to replace them. And so their sons and grandsons, and so it went on. Next in line to step up as the new priest. But does anybody remember what happened on Easter Sunday? It's an important part of this passage. I'm going home. Well done. We've got one at the back. He's not a dead priest, this Jesus. He rose from the dead, living this new covenant, this new way that God deals with his people. We don't need more than one priest anymore, one mediator, because Jesus is a priest by the power of his indestructible life, as verse 16 says. He sits at the right hand of the Father even now. He is the ultimate mediator, if you like. And his appointment to this position, this go-between, this as mediator, never ends. He doesn't get fired. His office doesn't reach full term. He doesn't retire. He holds his priesthood, verse 24, permanently because he continues in it forever. This is what Hebrews wants to communicate to us and get us to grasp and understand. We have a priest, a mediator, permanent and true, standing between us and God our Father, for us. Thomas Kuhn was a 20th century philosopher, and he coined the phrase paradigm shift. Don't know if anybody's heard the phrase. When you look at the word, it looks like paradigm. It's paradigm shift. Paradigm is basically the idea that what we know, how we think, how we behave even, the decisions we make, depends on our social structures, our understanding of the world around us. And so we act accordingly within that. These things all put together define the paradigm, if you like, under which we live. And we all do this. Even if we don't know how to pronounce the word paradigm, we still have a paradigm under which we live and move and breathe and do things. It's a way of viewing reality, if you like. And it dominates our thinking. And sometimes, as Thomas Kuhn said, we must shift our paradigms. And this, he went on to explain, is generally extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. Just as an example, the Swiss watch industry came up against this in some years ago. They dominated the watch industry for years, in the early 19th century onwards, until one day one of their own engineers, would you believe, came along and said, I've invented something. I've invented this newfangled digital thing, digital watch. And so it was presented to the executives and people that had the power to make decisions about the direction of the Swiss watch industry. And they looked at it and thought, nah, it's a passing fad. We won't go there. We are analog all the way. We'll stick to that. The Japanese picked up on the digital watch and produced it, and it crippled the Swiss watch industry for decades and even now. Why did this happen? The executives of the Swiss industry were not able to shift paradigms. Their realm of understanding was that the watch industry that they'd dominated and that they'd lived in was analog only. And so they made decisions accordingly. This is how paradigms work. They blind us to other ways of thinking, even if those other ways are the truth. Fundamentally, what the message of chapter 7 of Hebrews is a call to shift paradigms. It's a call in the first instance for the Hebrews listening to this letter to move from being Old Testament Jews orientated around the old priesthood, the old mediating system, sacrificial system, the Levites, and move to being Christ-centered in their understanding of it all. Like with the Swiss watchmakers, this shift doesn't come easily. And so many of the Jews that had given their lives to Christ were falling and failing and going back to the old ways and trying to maintain something of the old paradigm that they knew so well. The very things that Hebrews, this letter, is trying to tell them has been superseded, made obsolete, because Jesus has become the new priest, the priest forever, a permanent mediator for us. Now, the paradigm that we live in, if you like, the set of rules that we live out, the cultural structures that we inhabit don't include priests and Levites and temple and sacrifice and all that stuff. And so, on the one hand, we perhaps could be forgiven for thinking that this chapter in Hebrews is relevant for us today. But the call to shift paradigms, to shift in our view of the world and our understanding and our beliefs, is one that has Jesus at the centre, is not something that is confined to the first century or just to Jews who convert to following Jesus. Any conversion, any commitment of faith into Jesus is a paradigm shift. It is a shift from understanding the world without Jesus to understanding the world with Jesus at the centre. Just as Hebrews is calling its readers to do. It's to let go of all those preconceived ideas about the world we live in, about God even, about Jesus perhaps, and shift in your thinking to a point where you can say with conviction, in faith, Jesus, my Lord, my Saviour. And realise and understand and know that this Jesus, as verse 25 says, is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he is always there. He always lives to intercede for us. Like the Swiss watchmakers, this doesn't come easily, but it must come. God calls us to this paradigm shift. He asks us to commit to him in Christ. It requires faith. It requires you to allow God to reach down, if you like, and grab hold of you and soften your heart. Open your eyes to see the truth of this new paradigm, this freely offered way of relating to God, to see Jesus as our mediator. You see, having offered himself up as this perfect sacrifice for our sin, he became our high priest forever, the one that stands and still stands between God and us. This is the solution, remember, to the problem that we spoke of at the start. This is restored relationship with God. If God's speaking to you today, make this paradigm shift. Make it. Put your faith in Jesus. But be warned. If you're on this road already, if you like, it is easy to drift. In fact, a big part of why Hebrews was written was to encourage those that shift paradigms to not shift back. In chapter 2, verse 1, we read that we must pay careful attention therefore to what we have heard, lest we drift away. You see, we come to faith in Jesus and we sing hallelujah when we first come to faith, at the top of our lungs, and we bathe in the glory of salvation and we give thanks. But then life gets difficult, doesn't it? The kind of drudgery of life might set in, or we struggle, or we see tragedy around us and start asking questions, and the shine seems to come off the shoes. The joy seems to subside. And so it's so easy to drift. So easy to drift. The Hebrews that this letter was written to drifted back to the perceived safety of the old covenant and their understanding of priests and way of doing things. We need to ask, what things do we so easily drift back to? Things that give us perceived comfort and feelings of safety. The paradigms of life, if you like, that we should have left behind, but seem to sneak back in. The sin that so easily entangles, works-based righteousness of doing things that so easily ensnares, materialism and consumerism that so easily entices. We drift back to our old life, to the default position of society around us, to the problems of the world. And we fail to maintain Jesus at the centre because we fail to see him and seek him and have faith in him as our mediator, the one who right now stands before the Father on our behalf, the one who lives forever and therefore is able to always do this and always offer up intercession prayers for us, as verse 25 says. Do we really see him and relate to him like this, though? The one who is always and immediately available as our mediator. Many years ago on the farm at home, I've only been told stories about this, so we're not, just so you know, we're not so too backwards over there. All they had for water was a well and a pump. And every day or twice a day, someone would have to go out and pump this pump and put water in the tank so that they'd have water available. Finally, when pipes were invented or something, or when they had enough people to dig a trench, they put a pipe in to a spring a couple of 100 metres up the side of a hill. And so they had running water, constantly available, always there. You know, drifting back from this access to God, drifting away from the covering prayers of Jesus on our behalf, not recognising and seeking him as our permanent and constant mediator is foolhardy. It would be like pulling up all the water pipes again and going back to a pump and a well. Remember what Hebrews is telling us at the start of this chapter. Remember how I summarised it. Don't be so stupid. Let's turn on the constantly available taps of God's grace, if you like, and allow Jesus to be our permanent mediator of our relationship with God, and then live that out as the truth it is. This might require a paradigm shift, and that shift might be hard and call for sacrifice. It might require us to ask him for forgiveness, for going back to our old ways. It might mean seeking him for direction. As we continue on as a church serving and understanding what God calls us to, as we grow in our understanding of that, as we make these building changes to seek to live out God's purposes and connect with the community and to show others what it means to have a mediator, we must constantly do this. Turn our eyes to him, fix our eyes on Jesus, as chapter 12 of Hebrews says. Shift our paradigms, not drift back to the old and say, Jesus, you are at the centre because you are there now as our mediator between God and us.